Everyone. I'm excited to be here today to introduce our SGS webinar, Automotive and ESG, the Sustainability Mandate. Today's webinar will cover a short overview of who SGS is, definitions and a quick history, 5 North American drivers, 5-step cycle for automotive firms, automotive material topics and KPIs from the outside in, automotive next steps from the inside out, and Q&A. Please feel free to use that Q&A box to put in any questions you've got throughout the presentation. My name is Kim LaFrancois, and I'm the Regional Sales Manager for the industrial sector here at SGS. I've been in the testing, inspection, and certification industry for nearly 10 years, working with many different clients throughout various industries. The other speaker joining me today is Adam Hammis. Adam is the ESG Director at SGS and has 20 years of experience as corporate ESG sustainability consultant, author, and instructor. Adam has founded multiple organizations and has an MBA with international education and leadership experience, integrating ESG, CSR, and sustainability into corporate strategy. He has also taken many different courses to become a competent and effective resource for ESG and sustainability. I'll now pass it over to Adam so we can dive right in.
Thank you, Kim, and thanks to everyone for joining today. I know that everyone's very busy, but I'm really excited to talk about this topic, especially for the automotive industry. I'll briefly talk about SGS. Hopefully some of you know who we are, but we are the world's leading inspection, verification, and testing and certification company in the TIC industry for short. If you check out our website, we are boots on the ground around the world and over 140 years in business. Sustainability is embedded in the company from the top to the bottom, board and CEO levels, all the way down to the grassroots. And so we also have detailed sustainability and integrated report on our website if you want to check that out. We have, I'd say now it's probably about 30 years of experience in sustainability. We've been at the forefront of every major standard and scheme and been participating in working groups to not only later verify those standards, but to actually create some of them. We are always recognized. We love to show that we know what we are doing because we do it ourselves. So in our own operations, we're internationally recognized year over year with very high scores by everyone who scores companies in these types of sustainability topics. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but just to jump into today's topic, to get a baseline of where everybody is, one milestone that you could look at on your own journey is, has your organization published an annual ESG or sustainability report, possibly called a social impact report? It's just one way to see where you are in that process, because you basically get about 2 to 3 years once you start. It can take a little while to get going, to gather all your initiatives together and to actually create your first report. But as we'll talk about later, you typically see an annual cycle after that. You're going to be every 12 months, you're going to revisit that, especially if you're going to publish that report annually, which most companies today do. So I'll give it a little more time. I see people submitting their answers. Ours is a yes. I think we've done it for quite some time at SGS. And now we actually have an integrated report, which is sort of the leading edge type of a sustainability or ESG report. Integrated reports are financial information for investors is right alongside and in the same report as your environmental and social and governance. So I will give you about 5 more seconds and we'll keep going. So has your organization a lot of yeses, a lot of nos, and a lot of I don't knows, which is very common. So don't feel bad. Yeah, if you check out your website, ideally your company would have made some big promotion or communication about that. But if you go search on Google the name of your company and ESG report or sustainability report, it should pop up. So today, just so we don't get any mixed messages, we want to be clear of what we're saying when we say ESG and sustainability, especially for the automotive industry. We don't want to fall prey to some of the different uses of the term. So you can mean anything. People use ESG and sustainability very differently in different contexts. And so I want to make sure how we're talking about it today is specifically just non-financial reporting. This mostly came from publicly traded companies, but anything that is not measured in a currency is supposed to be material to your business is a non-financial reporting. It is called ESG because those are the 3 buckets. that it has been most commonly categorized underneath. And if you talk about ESG history, we're saying it came from the publicly traded sphere of publicly traded companies on the stock market, but it is now, as you probably know, really bleeding into supply chains and privately held smaller companies. But how do we get there? So really, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but it's been a slow and steady shift in the financial responsibility realm, just in the financial world, from historical cost accounting, which was like pre-1930, pre-1920s, to what we call decision useful data. And that's what investors want, decision useful data. So what happened in 1929 was the Great Depression, sent shockwaves around the world. And what came of that were a lot of reforms of the financial industry. It took about 10 years for this CAP, the Committee on Accounting Principles, to start allowing for exceptions. They said the big thing coming out of the reforms was people were not reporting enough, or companies were reporting misleading or non-material topics to distract from the reality of their financial position. So in the 1940s, when CAP started allowing exceptions to historical cost accounting, it sort of opened the floodgates to all this other information. So 10 years later, CAP was replaced by APB, which was the Accounting Principles Board. And they said, we have to standardize all of these exceptions. We can't just allow a lot of different exceptions. We have to have a standardization process. So it took them 10 years to decide, sort of internationally, that decision useful data was the focus, because there was a lot of disagreement that historical cost accounting for accuracy was not going to be the push. We were going to actually say, what is decision useful and who is that for? Mostly investors, people wanting to buy or sell, or financial institutions wanting to lend. Then, as you can see, the slowness of it, it took another 10 years for them to say the major decision useful data points that are not financial in nature are these E, S, and G. They called it at the time social goals of the companies. I think it was pretty generic. They call it also environmental externalities. And then governance was the management of those non-financial pieces of data. So one thing to remember in 1975, at that point, the S&P 500, 83% of all market cap value in the S&P 500 was tangible assets, which meant physical buildings, equipment, cars, things you could touch. And this marks sort of the shift away from that. And we'll show you on the next slide where we are today. And in 1980, that's the year I was born, that was the first time in the US, for instance, that they actually started mandatory requiring in your filings to have the MD&A, the management discussion and analysis portion for those non-financial things. They said we need context. It can't just be numbers. We have to understand the bigger picture. So fast forward, we completely ignore some of the other things we cover in our training, but in the environmental movement and the social movement were happening at the same time. And they sort of all converged in the 1990s, where a few things happened. The first big corporations, publicly traded corporations, Interface, it was a carpet company, made huge claims saying, we're going to be mission zero. You can still go watch documentaries about it. We're going to have zero negative impact on the planet and society. And the CEO of that company gathered all the different specialists and said, we don't have tools and standards for companies to do this. We just made this huge commitment, and we need to understand how to do it as a business. And so we've got this slow and steady building up of business tools and standards over the last 20 years, where you had the Global Reporting Initiative launched in 1997. We had our first best companies to work for Forbes list in 1998. It was all based on ESG criteria. The 2000 was the Millennium Goals, now known as the revamped UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. In 2004, the Global Compact came out of the UN. That was actually specifically for corporate groups, and it was just 10 principles. 6 of them were social, 3 environmental, 1 financial. In 2007, the LOHAS consumer group was actually identified for the first time. Lifestyles of Health and Sustainability said 13% of the population in the US at that time was willing to pay more money for socially and environmentally responsible products and services. And that has been tracked now over time. A big thing happened in 2008, where the Great Recession hit from the collapse of the housing market. What they did find, which was really telling, was that all the things pretty much took a dip, because you see ESG or sustainability topics, seen as a nice to have, but not a mandatory. But human beings continue to spend more money on one thing, which was personal health and wellness for them and their families, so that they saw that that had real staying power and it continued to drive business. Integrated reporting started in 2009. I discussed that. It's just putting it all in one report, not having a bunch of marketing pieces, but having very third-party assured, confident data on your ESG data that is reported at the end of the year. In 2011, SASB was created. They basically said, very business friendly, we're going to have 77 different industries. We're going to do all the materiality assessment and just give you an off-the-shelf list of topics and metrics that you should report for your industry. Some people love it for that reason. Some people don't like it for that reason, but it was meant to fast forward businesses to skip some steps and say, hey, here's some industry relevant data for you. Jeffrey threw up a question. I'll get to that in just a second. In 2016, BlackRock wrote their first letter that just said, hey, we want to see ESG reported in your most recent in your filings. We're going to start looking for that kind of material data. And then 2020, the big thing from the market cap, you fast forward 15 years, and 90% of the market value of the S&P 500 is in intangible assets, which means mostly intellectual property, goodwill, and brand value. And those are things besides intellectual property that can quickly disappear if you're building up a loyalty in either your business to business or your consumer, your client base, based on your reputation of doing environmentally and socially responsible things. And if you have bad PR or something happens, or if you're uncompliant, that can disappear a lot of market value. It can just vanish. And so there's a lot of interest in how we maintain and protect that intangible value within the company. And then in 2022, the World Economic Forum, which interviews and surveys like over 1,000 business leaders across the globe, said what is the number one economic risk, not social and environmental, but economic risk, and climate was number one, and COVID was number two. And so those things continue to rise to the surface. With Jeffrey, this is great for your question. What's your take on the recent actions by BlackRock and Vanguard? Vanguard joins BlackRock in rejecting more ESG proposals from shareholders. And so the rejecting of proposals and shareholders is that I think they realized that once they opened the gate in 2016, which is we'll get to that point of why I think it was very positive, is that you open the door for a lot of activists and shareholders and to sort of latch onto that. And I think they saw a huge increase for the good. And now you've got, probably rightfully so, people pushing back, even in litigation, and saying, hey, some of these are not material to our business. Some of these shareholder proposals, some of these even portfolios that are trying to brand themselves as ESG and sustainability, they cannot back it up with material topics or data that shows it's relevant to our business. And it does feel like a very activist bent. And so that is being sorted out kind of in the mix. And so I think they're going to continue to keep having that. To me, it's for the best, but that's my best take on that, Jeffrey. I hope it answers your question. But I don't think that's going to go away. I think we're going to keep seeing the thrust from the historical trend is more business tools and standards than we've ever had before. They're also coming into more alignment than we've ever seen before. So I want to differentiate between these two. So financial materiality is ESG. If it's in the ESG category from the public sphere, if it's driven by investors, it's purely talking about what are those impacts of environmental issues and social issues on the business itself and our profits. So it's not the other way around. So ESG, typically financial materiality, has a lot of staying power because it's investor driven and they're looking for very material topics. Impact materiality, when you add that in, is often when people start calling it sustainability. When it's the feel good stuff of what's not only what are the impacts to the company and how should they respond to these things that impact them, but how is the business itself impacting positively or negatively society and the environment. And that tends to be the double materiality that Europe is seeing. GRI is baked in. That's where there's a lot of pushback saying, we don't know if we can handle all of this. This is a lot of things to manage. But double materiality or impact materiality is when you're talking about how the business impacts society and the planet. So there's two very different things, but one builds off of the other. What you can see and why that's happening and why it's important is that just 2 months ago, I'll talk, jump to the end, IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards, just launched their first 2 standards. So all of that was a result of the last 3 to 5 years where the integrated reporting standards, the SASB standards and the TCFD standards for climate were all investor driven, and they were all ESG, like pure financial materiality for businesses. They all combined in this value reporting foundation about 2 years ago, and that has now been absorbed into IFRS. And now what they released is something called S1 and S2, which combines it all and makes it much easier for people to follow, has very simple principles, and it's meant to align and make it easier for businesses specifically. Whereas below this orange line, you have the things that continue to live on. These are more of the feel good, do good for the world, do good for society, solve world hunger types of things, GRI. And they have said very clearly, they work closely hand in hand with IFRS, but they say we're not going to give up the impact materiality. We're going to align with you and try to launch our own sector specific standards, which they've announced 44 of those, but GRI will continue to be in the sustainability realm, as well as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But they're launching something called SDG Impact, which is meant for corporations, because a lot of their stuff is very heavily focused on business. So when you hear these different things, know that there's one thread that's very purely for the business community, driven by investors, and the other is more of the what's good for the planet and society. That's a lot of information. What trend does your business see in stakeholder expectations for ESG and sustainability performance? So no matter what you hear today on this webinar, I'll always tell you, don't adopt anything off the shelf. When people tell you, hey, this is what everybody should do, it's very regional, it's very industry specific. We're going to talk about automotive today, but it's also very company specific. So you're never exactly the same as another company. You might have different size, different scope, be vertically integrated in different ways. So I'm never saying that just because there's a trend historically for these things, and these are the tools that are happening, what you should ask yourself is, what trend are you seeing? Do you have no interest in ESG and sustainability performance, no change, or are you seeing an increasing amount of asks, or actually is it going down for you? Are you actually, the demand for ESG and sustainability performance is going down? Because that's what's going to determine how you approach your strategy for your company. I'll give about 5 more seconds. I'll tell you, for us, it's increasing. And so here, a lot of folks say no or no change, which is totally great. Nobody says decreasing, which is interesting. A lot of 70% say increasing. I think this is very common for what we see. I rarely see people say decreasing just because of that kind of overall push. But sometimes you're in an industry where you're actually well aware of the needs, and it's not really changed, and the drivers are still the same. So let's jump into what those drivers are, because it's going to be very telling for how you set up your strategy and what kind of company you are, because if you're, for instance, publicly traded or not publicly traded, some of these things matter. The number one driver in North America, which we're typically behind in regulations, and that still is the case, about 5 years behind Europe, South America, and Eastern Asia, is these ESG rating companies. And the reason that it's driving most still in North America is because it's not dependent on regulation. It's driven by investors and creditors who are looking for a way to measure those folks that they buy, sell, or lend to. And that's why those were created over the last 10 years, roughly. And they all are growing pretty slowly now. Most of them have plateaued. Dow Jones Sustainability Index is just the top 300 companies. It applies to very few of you. But MSCI and ISS kind of expanded into ESG topics, while Sustainalytics was created brand new, focused purely on ESG. But EcoVadis has completely taken over, while all the others are purely for publicly traded companies. Whether or not you wanted them to, they took your publicly available data off the internet and they scraped it and they gave these companies a score. And that's how the the investors and the banking financial institutions started making some decisions based off of that. Where EcoVadis is actually the bigger brands, which we'll talk about next, and it is skyrocketing growth, kind of hockey stick growth, and it's the youngest and newest platform of the ones you see here. And that's because the supply chain customers are those giant brands, those big brands are now asking their suppliers, and they're pushing down these mandates or requests into their supply chain and saying, hey, we need to see visibility because we have risks in our supply chain. One example of that is everyone uses GHG protocol for climate emissions reporting, but then ISO came out in 2006, and it was still basically GHG protocol, but written in an ISO format. However, in 2018, the new version of ISO 14064-1 required a risk assessment in the supply chain. It was no longer optional to do supply chain greenhouse gas emissions. And you can look across the board, most assurance standards, most verification standards, most rating agencies are now expecting these bigger brands to have supply chain visibility because that's where most of their risk lies. So CDP is purely for climate disclosures. It has 13,000 reporters right now. 19 of those are automakers, major brands who have said we're going to become supply chain members, and 19 automakers and automotive companies are now sending surveys out to their suppliers and saying, we need you to start reporting into CDP. And so you may or may not have gotten those CDP requests yet, but it's coming, and most of you probably have gotten them, but that's why. And then there's a larger initiative where EcoVadis is a platform for ESG data. So it's not just climate, it's E, S, and G, industry-specific types of data that they've grouped you into. And there is an accelerated initiative with 4 major automotive brands. It's called, it's actually referred to as mobility, I think. But that's coming, and those initiatives are growing faster. More brands are hopping on board. So then you'll start seeing surveys, if you haven't already, that's saying, you're a supplier of us, X, Y, and Z major brand. We need you to start reporting into EcoVadis. And the reason people are less hesitant about EcoVadis is that it's private or semi-private, where you report, but it's not, I can't personally, Adam Hammis, go to the internet and look at your score. You give a specific brand permission to see your score, and that's it. And they roll up all of your data into an aggregate score within the system. So there's a lot less barriers to entry. People are they're not so resistant to it, I would say, but it is coming from a major supplier. So that's why people are doing it, not because of regulatory pressure. We have a ratings boost service, so we'd be happy to chat with you if you want to connect with us after this. I think it's incredibly important, and we do a great job of tying it directly to your strategy, not just chasing points, but it is intended to improve your score. So now we'll talk about regulations. And it's the third driver. It's not that it's not important, but we're just not that strict here in the North America. Canada and the US is our region that I mostly focus on. We do have large, both in US and Canada, large greenhouse gas reporting programs that you probably aren't subject to, but what's happening, which is changing, is there's a federal supplier climate rule in both of these countries that have been proposed, and in the next year will probably be approved. And that's saying any large suppliers who have contracts with the US and Canadian government over a certain size, I think it's 7.5 million for the US, 25 million for Canada, is that you will have to start reporting. And if you're over 50 million with the government, you have to start not only reporting scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, but setting science-based targets and disclosing within CDP. The bigger change that people are also looking at is the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, which would apply to all publicly traded companies. That climate rule has been held up in the court for about a year, and we're expecting some announcement in October of 2023, whether that rule is going to be approved or not. And that will impact a lot of publicly traded companies. But the federal supplier rule is whether you're private or not. The SEC ruling is only if you're public. And so those are the ones that have real teeth, and they're still in the proposed category. And then if you have a huge network, if you're working with Europe, or if you're working with Brazil or Eastern Asia, you really need to look into their regulatory schemes, because they have a lot of teeth and they have more disclosure requirements than the US and Canada. A distant fourth and fifth would just say that Consumers are asking for this. It's a huge market, that LOHAS, lifestyles and health and sustainability that we mentioned, willing to pay more money for environmentally and socially responsible products. It's a huge market, growing very fast in the US. And even the McKinsey group, which surveys businesses and consumers every year, they have it at 70% of consumers willing to pay more for green products. But what's telling is that 50% of companies surveyed say that the reason they're investing in sustainability is their business growth, that's where they're actually launching into new markets, offering new products and new services that are selling well for them. And it's not their own internal operations, but it's driving their future sales. And last but not least is employees. The talent wars are real. People are having a hard time finding qualified candidates. Not so much those lower positions, but if you look at high paid, hard to find positions where you're trying to often encourage people to come move or leave another company, that it does become very telling that 83% of employers or employees surveyed in the UK thought that employers were not doing enough and they would actually prefer working for a better company. Whereas the IBM 2022 Institute for Business Value survey, which is a huge survey in 10 different countries, they still had similar results. 67% say they were more willing to apply for and accept positions with quote unquote sustainable companies, which that is a difference of whatever people think that means, but anyone that they think is environmentally and socially responsible at some level. And so it's something to keep in mind. They're definitely much smaller drivers than the top three. So again, I said a lot of things, and what matters for your organization is what is the number one driver for you. There's probably a mix. There's probably two, maybe three that are really driving things for your company. But if you're publicly traded, it might be ESG ratings. If you're privately held, it could be supply chain. You could be very much having a specific regulation that from possibly another country that we're not aware of, that you're trying to meet the CSRD in Europe. But you have to know what your number one driver is, because that's what's going to drive what kind of program you set up, because you can't do everything. You can't respond to every ESG request or sustainability request from every different angle. You really have to say, what is our focus and what's our priority? And the way to do that is to know what your number one driver is. And ideally, you would want to know what your number two, number three drivers are as well. And if you have another one that we didn't mention, just choose F and type it in. And I'll give you a few more seconds. I see a question here as well from Sarawi, so I'll show these first. So this is very common. I'm actually surprised to see 11% on the employees, but it's definitely real. It's definitely something people are interested in, especially the younger generation. But supply chain customers is huge, and it's not something that surprises me. I think what I often call it is the EcoVadis effect, or just the second wave. The first wave was the big brands under a lot of pressure. The second wave is suppliers to those big brands are now under pressure. Sorry, your question was, what do those numbers mean really in practice? And I guess I'm not sure which numbers you're referring to, so I apologize. But if you want to type in a second one, just let us know what numbers you're referring to, and I'll tell you in practice the best answer that I can give you. So what's a 5-step cycle for automotive firms? You start looking at those drivers, start looking at the history of this. It's not going away. It's only kind of increasing but aligning, making it simpler. But you really have to think about 5 clear steps. Anytime you plan this in, you don't just respond knee-jerk to any of those requests that you get. And there's a lot of things to sift through. People often call it the alphabet soup of ESG and sustainability. Step 1 is awareness, and you really have to understand what are the issues, trends, and strategies that are affecting your company. Are you an automotive manufacturer? Are you a parts manufacturer? Are you in the repair business? What is it that you do? Are you service-oriented, product-oriented? And you really understand those issues and trends and strategies before you go set your own priorities. Often this number 2 priority stage, there's what's called a materiality assessment, and that it varies in what you can do, but there's a very detailed look at stakeholder engagement and asking outside and internal entities for answers that are very clear of what are the priorities and why. And those have to include risks, but also opportunities. It's the operational risks to our business, but also what are the sales opportunities or the market opportunities for us to capture. And then once you've done that, you can actually create your own strategy for the company that includes a vision, KPIs, goals, and plans that you execute upon in the next stage with actual initiatives, projects, quality control, and then eventually, hopefully, you're able to report. You get into the reporting phase, you're typically reporting management of these initiatives and the performance over time. And that's how you do it. The maturity, every time you go through the cycle, your company will become more mature. And like I said, the first 2 to 3 years, it could take 2 to 3 years to get your first report if you choose to make an annual report. But after that, you're basically on a 12-month cycle. And that's why I said it becomes pretty standard after that. And Sarari said, numbers shown earlier about companies' ratings. Okay, I want to bounce just really quick to answer your question. So he was talking about the ESG ratings, and the numbers are an aggregate score, a composite score that aggregates usually some sub-scores of environmental, social, and governance. EcoVadis has a fourth score that is supply chain specifically. And the things they all have in common that to give you confidence that they're useful is that they all have those aggregate scores from sub-scores, very similar, and they all show you where you stack up against your industry. So they have to put you in an industry group. They have to define why they put you in that group, and then they show how you stack up, not only what your score is, but how it is against your peers. The thing that people complain about those of whether they're useful or not, and some of the litigation, most of the litigation that people are branding like ESG backlash, is when people use a score that does not have transparency to what that score is, and that some of the scores are varying greatly. They give you a very poor score in one rating system and a very good score in another rating system. And they say they put you in the same industry and they don't tell you why your scores are so different. So their algorithms are not essentially transparent and vetted by any government agency or any controlled agency. All these rating agencies are privately held companies that were invented or launched in the last 20 years. They initially started to serve a particular investor group that had specific needs and desires, but as for-profit companies do, they expanded and said, hey, we can help more people, we can sell more business, and then they just started becoming, larger and larger. And so many of them have gone out of business and don't exist anymore, but there's the 5 or 6 that I showed are the ones that have continued on. Whether they combine later or not, we'll see. But when you say what do those numbers mean, they are an attempt to score companies on a scale of good to bad and in material topics. So that's really hard to put a finger on it because it's highly complex data sets. Here's an example for Ford. So we'll jump in. Good question. Sorry for the tangent, everybody, but I think it's a great question. So when you talk about those first 3 stages I mentioned, it's, I'll go back just in case we forgot, that awareness, priorities, and strategy. You can see that play out in exactly how companies report. They have a governance piece of who is going to be doing this work, who's going to look and scan the environment and the market for our strategies, for the trends, for the risks, for the regulations that are coming down the pipe. And so Ford is showing, here's our senior governance committee and who's focused on topics. Then they conducted their own materiality assessment. They describe how they conducted it, and they ranked all of their topics and issues into different categories, not only of the impact to what they think internally as a business, but what do their stakeholders think and expect from them. And then you'll basically have a top right, these are the most critical, and then it kind of slants down to the bottom left of least critical. But they identify why they chose to focus on which topics, and then they build an entire strategy around that, which includes setting topics, descriptions, KPIs, targets, things like that. And you can read this. I think it's a 100+ page report, but they very clearly lay out that same process that they went through. And then Denso, another automotive example, they've got their corporate governance laid out here, not with pictures of people, but describing exactly what their committee's structure is who's responsible for ESG and sustainability. Their materiality assessment is more of just a stacked chart, and then it went into some big summary descriptions. And then here it comes down into a very detailed list of all their targets. Of every single topic that they have listed, here's all of our targets, and then you can read the rest of their, and then down here they actually have their materiality assessment as well. And then you can read their 100-page report that goes into detail of all the things that they are listing. Do have a question here. Sorry, I'll jump over. Greg says we're getting requests from our automotive customers to do ESG reporting. Automotive is only about 20% of my company's business. I'm getting some pushback as I believe ESG reporting would be necessary for the entire company. Is there a possibility to score just the automotive division, or do you need to do the entire company? It's a great question, especially for complex companies who don't fit nicely into any one box. I would say that no. The general answer is no. You're typically not able to score a division. You typically are only able to receive a score on the entirety of your company. And here's why. The chart that I showed you, the 4 or 5 at the top, were all focused on publicly traded companies that they just scraped public data. There's actually not a lot of back and forth. And even if there is any back and forth, like ISS has a good dialogue. Like you can submit every week if you want to, but you have to be directing them to say this is a public disclosure, and so it's really not that fast. So you have to have your public disclosures up and available, and that's why they're not really going to be able to dive into the automotive division of your company, for instance. Whereas EcoVadis, also just because it's one of the few platforms that is not purely for publicly traded companies, they only score an entire company. You'd have to reach out to them directly and maybe ask for some special request. I just think that they're so huge right now and they're growing so fast. My personal opinion and professional opinion is that you wouldn't be able to do that. So I apologize, but hopefully try to give you an explanation of why it is that way. And then the reason that we do this sequence is we mitigate risk. The leadership of your company wants to have some very uncomfortable, sometimes, conversations behind closed doors about what is most important for your company. And some things you're going to do and some things you're not going to do. And it's never going to make everyone happy, but it is an important business decision. And then no one's really seeing that happen, and it's private. Once you start executing in stage 4 or step 4, your employees are going to know that you're changing your business, and some of your close business partners are going to know, but they're just going to see that in your day-to-day operations. Whereas step 5 is you really need to be sure and take some care, because if you put out any kind of public reporting, no matter how you intended it to be read or who you intended it to be for, it's public. It'll get its way on the internet. People will find it. So you want to have compliance people, legal, communications, marketing people, all working together to say, we're putting this together for our external stakeholders. This is the story we're going to tell about our company, and we really need to do it well and thoughtfully. And that's why there's typically a senior ESG committee made up of senior leaders in the company that are making that strategy. There are very different people who are project managers, ops managers, subject matter experts, risk and quality managers who are actually implementing the day-to-day. It needs to be treated as any other business initiative. And then these reporters, investor relations, government affairs, legal compliance, internal communications, external marketing and sales. But they're different people do different parts of this strategy for your ESG journey. So for you, it's really nice to know what are the steps of the ESG cycle that fit strongest with your current role. Are you a strategist? Are you here to learn about how you create your own company strategy? And are you sitting on an ESG kind of senior committee, or are you the one person tasked with kind of coordinating all of the efforts? Or are you an implementer? Are you running an energy program? Are you running a DEI program for your company? Are you sort of in the weeds doing the day-to-day? Or are you a reporter? Are you collecting that information from the data owners, putting it into the story at the end of the year, or newsletter, or regulatory submission that you have to do? What's your role specifically? Because if you know where you are on the team, you might also be able to say like, hey, I should probably be better connected with my implementers and my strategists so that we're all on the same page and I can give feedback. It's also important when you get into training, because we offer a ton of training at SGS. And you, as a strategist, you need different training than you do as an implementer. And as a reporter, you need different strategy or different training as well. You can't be learning the same things because there's so much training out there that you'll never take it all. And you really need to focus on the things that are going to benefit you and your company the most in the shortest amount of time for the least amount of money. All right, a few more seconds. People are still coming on. This is great. Sometimes I see a lot more strategists in the conversation when we have these webinars, but we've got a really, really nice balance of strategists, implementers, and reporters. What I would just encourage you to do is, whatever role you are in, be friends and make good friends with each of these categories, because that's how you're going to make the most of your time and effort and your money for your company. And so definitely seek out implementers and strategists and reporters within your company, because they will be your best friends. We do have trainings. Our ESG training is actually, for this one, you'd have to come to our November course. We offer them quarterly, but we have a foundation course, which is on-demand video. We have a course specifically for strategists and those leaders who are creating company strategy. We have an execution course for people who are implementing day to day, and we have a reporting course for those in doing any kind of communication around ESG. Just go to SGS Academy, and if you Google that, you'll find all of our courses. We have a huge learning library. So automotive, let's get into the nitty-gritty of the topics themselves, because automotive is going to have different topics, material, and we're going to take, right now, we're going to take an outside-in look. So we're going to look from the perspective, because it's global. A lot of these are global, but these are standards, frameworks, and rating agencies. What are they saying about the automotive industry? And most of those have some level of multi-stakeholder industry collaboration, where automotive companies were at the table for some of these discussions, but it is not an inside outlook, which we'll talk about last. This is really, what is the market and what are the rating agencies, standards, and frameworks say about the automotive industry. So in order, the things that tend to be the highest priority are just governance issues. It's, are you putting people in place to manage your environmental and social and governance topics? What structure does that look like? What are the names and qualifications? Have you done stakeholder engagement? List and identify those material topics. And then certifications. Do you have a governance standard certification for your company and or your tier 1 suppliers? You know, ISO 27001, ISO 37001. These are the types of things sort of really that SGS is known for and can help companies do, and we do have all the core ISO standards, but then also looking into your supply chain and managing your supply chain. Are they doing governance standards as well? The thing that the parts and equipment, which I'll show you if you look at the top, there's always going to be a little indicator. Most of these align pretty specifically and pretty well with whether you're an auto manufacturer or you're a parts and equipment manufacturer. I'm just going to show you two. There are others, but these are the two biggest. Monetary losses from anti-competitive behavior is actually something that parts and equipment has that the manufacturers are not looking at, which is kind of obvious why. Stealing intellectual property, and definitely just anything that is, you know, anti-competitive. If you want to get into your 37001 ISO standard, there's a lot of details, but that's one difference. All the others apply equally to manufacturers and parts and equipment. Very little difference in product safety and quality. We're looking there. Folks are looking for certification to any safety standard. There's TSAX, there's IATF 16949, ISO 26262, ISO 21434. These are all things that we also specialize in at SGS, and they look at not only is your company doing it yourself, but are any of your tier 1 suppliers certified to any safety standard as well? And they want to know which ones. They don't want generic reporting. 5-star ratings for vehicle models by CAP, programs, safety-related defect complaints, recalled vehicles or units of product. These are pretty standard types of KPIs that people want to see. In labor management comes third, very consistent. There's not a real difference here between parts and equipment and manufacturers. any workforce covered under collective bargaining agreements, work stoppages, and days idle. Certification to social standards, one of the most common is ISO 45001 for your own employees, but then also tier 1 suppliers. How many of them are certified to any social standard like ISO 45001? Environmental carbon footprint. So is the fourth most popular. It's in the environmental category, so I'm just giving it a label. As you can see, labor management was social, product safety and quality is social. Environmental, the number one environmental across most every industry is carbon footprint at this point. There is a slight difference in parts and equipment, which you'll see at the bottom, but some of them want a product carbon footprint for a very specific product. Often this is if you have multiple products, one is the highest revenue, it has the highest impact by sales volume, that they want a carbon footprint of that actual product itself. And that's just drawing your boundaries differently. We specialize in helping companies do that. That's ISO 14067 versus ISO 14064-1, which is for your entire organization. That's when they want scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions, and that's for the whole company. They want to know if you're certified to a climate standard. I just mentioned those, but 14064-1 is for an organization, 14067 is for a product, and CDP is just whether you're reporting to the CDP platform, and then whether your tier 1 suppliers are also doing that. Are they certified to any climate standard, and are they reporting emissions to any platform, which CDP is the most popular. Parts and equipment are also usually asked to, and people want to hear from you on energy consumed from the grid and renewables. That's specific because a lot of the other greenhouse gas emissions for the auto manufacturers comes from additional things besides facilities, whereas largely parts and equipment is their facility. They're talking about just those parts that they're making in their facility and industrial processes. And for some reason, not really interested, they must assume that manufacturers are going to roll that up and see it as well in a more composite score. We do have an amazing team on greenhouse gas training. Would be sad to not mention that we have a 4-day option where you can actually become a lead verifier if you want to, all the way up. That's a very comprehensive training. We do have some of our clients take that, but you can take module 1, module 3 separately. And that's for very beginners, just what is the background to reporting carbon accounting. And then number 2 is how you quantify and actually put together an emissions inventory. And then 3, how you prepare your team for a verification if you're actually going to have a third party provide verification of your statement and what that process looks like. To continue on, the 5th most common is fuel efficiency. So that's really obviously for the manufacturers because they're designing the larger automobile themselves, but also for parts and equipment manufacturers because you are basically composite making up the car, everything that you build and everything you design. So they're looking for sales weighted average passenger fleet fuel economy. Often it's across the entire portfolios of cars that are offered, but sometimes it's for specific fleets. What are your zero emission, hybrid, and plug-in vehicles sold, and what's the percentage? Strategy for managing fleet fuel economy risks and opportunities. Often that's like a context disclosure. It's just a written several paragraphs about how you identify risks and how you manage those risks. And then also on just parts and equipment, they're looking at revenue from products that have improved fuel efficiency in their cars downstream. Environmental, this is 6th. Materials, what you make your materials out of and how you source your materials. Critical materials risk management, again, that's usually a disclosure. It's a written disclosure describing how your risk management practice. Waste and recycling data from your manufacturing processes. End-of-life material recovered and recycled. Recyclability of vehicles and products sold, as in, at the end user, is there a way to dismantle and reuse? And then for parts and equipment manufacturers, you also have hazardous waste, any hazardous waste disclosures in your manufacturing process, and then any input materials that you're using that are from recycled or remanufactured content. So that's a lot of stuff, but has your organization conducted a formal materiality assessment? Because even though I've shown you what's the most popular from the outside in, materiality assessment which would still use a lot of this big picture outside in, what are the frameworks and standards and rating agencies pushing for. A materiality assessment for your company would help you sift even further through that and identify maybe you only have 3 KPIs that you really need to focus on that are material to your business. If you're publicly traded and you're working in multiple regions around the world, you're probably going to have far more, but a materiality assessment with stakeholder engagement would be the answer. That's how you find that out. No one's going to tell you. There's only a process that you can identify those things for yourself. So if you've conducted one, that's great. If you haven't, that's also great. If you don't know, it's one of the things that are not as easy to find. If you have a public annual ESG report or an annual sustainability report, it was very common and is still fairly common to put your materiality assessment in those reports. But some companies who have been doing this for 10 or 12 years, they've actually stopped putting it in. And I don't know if that's to save face or if they just haven't updated it in a while. But that's one way to find out, is to go look at your annual report. The answer for us is it does. So we have no, that's a little surprising, but it's not a big deal. Usually there's some that have. The larger companies typically have gone through that process. It can be expensive. I'll say that SGS, we tend to focus on small and medium-sized companies, so we can conduct and help conduct different scales of materiality assessment. If you're going to do a double materiality assessment that's basically to the European Union CSRD standards, that's very complex and rigorous and takes probably a minimum of 6 months, and those can be very expensive. If you don't have to do it to that level, there's a lot of options that we can provide for you, so reach out to SGS. And if you don't know if you've done one, please go look at your annual report if you have one, because it might be in there. And I just recommend that's one way to look. And if not, if you don't have an annual report, it's probably unlikely that you've done a materiality assessment. Another question, have you gotten any third-party assurance for your ESG and sustainability reporting? So one of the things that we're seeing a lot, huge push, is third-party assurance. That is just having an independent body like SGS. So this is something we know a lot about, to check the accuracy, not only of your final reported data, but of the system and the process and the data collection and the quality control of how that data was collected. So you could say, yes, greenhouse gas emissions only. That's called a greenhouse gas verification. Usually it's the ISO standard 14064-1, or like I said, a 14067 if you're doing a product. Because climate change is the #1 issue that's at the top of most people's lists around the world, a lot of people start with a greenhouse gas verification. It's something that our team knows and does very well, but often that's kind of your first step into third-party verification of sustainability data itself. Or you could do your entire report, just a few KPIs, where you could say ESG KPIs means 7 different stats, like your energy, water, waste, your turnover, your DEI initiatives. You just wanted to handpick, these are our 7 most important, we're going to get third-party assurance, and that's basically what a CPA would do for your financials. It's a similar process, but we have highly technical engineering folks who do it for non-financial data. Or you can do your whole report. GRI compliant reports, SASB compliant reports are the most common. It means the entire report complies with a standard. GRI is the Global Reporting Initiative. SASB is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And that's more comprehensive and takes longer, but it's probably the most comprehensive one you can get. Or you can just say, no, we haven't done any, or I don't know. But it's becoming more important, definitely for investors, because they are making decisions off of this information, but also because of greenwashing and the amount of, anytime any topic becomes very popular and the number of organizations doing it increases, there's always going to be a small percentage of those companies that are not doing it with integrity. And that's usually what not only greenwashing kind of claims, but greenwashing litigation is happening. And so that's why third-party assurance is sometimes very important to set yourself apart from the others. So yes to GHG emissions and no and I don't know. So not a very popular piece. So if you're ever interested in learning more about it, we're happy to explain it to you and the benefits. So just contact SGS. We have KPI verification and assurance. We also have greenhouse gas verification, like I said. And the last step before I just stop for Q&A is that we're going to be doing automotive research that will launch in early 2024 of that inside out. We'll say, that's great. Everything we shared with you today is what's happening outside in, but what are the actual automotive companies doing? The 100 largest companies, what's happening? What's the most popular type of reporting behavior and trends in reality? What frameworks and standards are they using? What material topics are they reporting on? What kind of KPIs and targets and certifications? So that's going to come out, and it's going to be much more telling as well about what peers are doing. And I think that's just great to look at every issue from every angle and have more data. Several questions popped in here, but we have plenty of time. I wanted to thank you for just being here and taking time out of your day to learn about this, to ask really good questions along the way. I love to answer questions in the middle of the webinar, but we've got materiality assessments are very cost prohibitive. Are they really necessary? I kind of went into that. I hope I talked about it, but I'll just say, yes, I think some version of a materiality assessment is necessary. They're only cost prohibitive if you really have a strong regulatory requirement to do a double materiality assessment like CSRD in the European Union. But if you think they're too expensive, come talk to us. Reach out to myself and Kim. We have options that we can sell it to your company and give you still really, really useful information, but taking stuff off the shelf just because somebody else told you to do it, which is what standards and frameworks and rating agencies can provide you. That's really helpful, but they should all be applied very specifically to your company. We haven't received any requests from big customers in the supply chain to report to CDP or EcoVadis. Do we need to worry about this? Great question. Yes, is my answer. I would at least really encourage you to go to the website. So you could research CDP supply chain members, and you can see all the large companies that are signing on to, they've agreed to say, we're going to ask our suppliers to report to CDP. And EcoVadis is the same way. Look up EcoVadis industry initiatives, and you can find all the industry initiatives that are growing every day that they've agreed that they're going to ask all of their suppliers to report into EcoVadis. So I wouldn't necessarily worry about it, but I would definitely research it. And if you don't see your customers, but you see a bunch of other companies that are your customers, competitors and peers, and are, people you wish were your customers, then it's a pretty good sense that they might join, because it's very competitive. People are joining partly just to be a leader, but they also then join later because they don't want to be the only companies not involved in the initiative. And so definitely check it out. Another question, do you recommend waiting until the new SEC and federal supplier rules are adopted before taking action? I do not. I would at a minimum tell you to get trained. Go understand at least what the ruling is. It is it is very specifically climate disclosure. It's not ESG broad, it's GHG emissions. So that SEC ruling is climate disclosure. It's only for publicly traded companies. So if you are public, you should look at it and understand what they're going to be asking for. And at a minimum, probably prepare yourself for some climate disclosure, because not only is the White House doing it, the large companies around the world without any regulatory pressure are asking their suppliers to do it. So if EcoVadis or CDP or the supplier rules or the SEC rules, any of those could apply to you, or all of them could apply to you. So definitely check out climate disclosure at a minimum. And we have some great training. Talk to Kim, but I wouldn't wait on that one, because climate disclosure is definitely #1 around the world, and it has the fastest growth and the most legs behind it. I can stick around if there's any more questions. I know we're at 1:59. I'm glad we didn't go over, but I'm happy to answer more questions. Those are all the ones I see in my Q&A box.
Well, it looks like that's all the questions for now. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me or Adam if there are any other questions or if we can be of any help. Thank you so much, Adam, for all this wonderful information. And thank you all for your time. We hope you have a great day.
Thank you, Kim. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks. Thank you.